So welcome everyone. Welcome to the Kennedy Center Lecture Series here from Brigham Young University. We've had a great series this semester with some excellent lecturers talking about our theme, Challenges to Democracy. But I'm very excited for today's lecture with our own Jeremy Pope, who's as well qualified to address challenges to our own democracy as I think anyone certainly we've had in this series. So look forward to an excellent lecture today. Before we get started, let me make a couple of announcements. First of all, next week, we'd just like to remind you that we still have one more week in the series. Next week is the week of our Kennedy Research Fellows, in which we will have lectures by two students who have submitted research papers on the semester's theme, and they will be speaking next week at the same time via Zoom, the same part of the series. And I've read the papers; they're really interesting. So I encourage you to tune in for that next week. Excuse me. And then we also have two other presentations coming up, which look to be very interesting. The first is one of our AMAs, right, which stands for Ask Me Anything, with Jeff and Lynette Rands, who will be talking about careers in diplomacy. And you can talk to them and ask them any questions you have if you're interested in those kinds of careers. That's tomorrow at 1 o'clock via Zoom. The second is also tomorrow. This is at 5 o'clock, and it's part of the Public Affairs Career Series. And it's with Emily O'Loughlin, who's a principal at McKinsey & Company, and she's going to be answering questions about management consulting. You can find more information and also register for the Zoom meetings by going to the Kennedy Center website, and we'll also place the links for those events in the chat. Okay, now I would like to very briefly introduce our speaker. Jeremy C. Pope is a professor of political science here at BYU. He's also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy. So perfect choice for the concluding faculty lecturer in our series. He's the author and co-author of numerous articles, reviews, books about both contemporary American politics and the drafting and meaning of the United States Constitution. So right, kind of ideally qualified for the talk he's going to be giving us today. For the purposes of this lecture, I just want to highlight two recent publications. Last year, an article written with Michael Barber entitled, "Does Party Trump Ideology? Disengaging Party and Ideology in America," which appeared in the American Political Science Review. And then his most recent book, written with co-author Sean Trier, which is called "Founding Factions: How Majorities Shifted and Aligned to Shape the U.S. Constitution," which is just out from the University of Michigan Press. And I mean just out, right? It was released yesterday, according to Dr. Pope. So anyway, look forward to hearing from him about this important challenge facing American democracy today. And so please join me in giving the warmest Zoom welcome we can to Professor Jeremy Pope.
Okay, well, I guess I'll take my mask off now. I did want to start with my mask because I'm wearing my official Captain America mask. It was a close call between Captain America and Batman, but I thought Captain America was more appropriate for today. But we're going to be talking about parties and the Constitution and how they don't fit together well. I want to say a couple of quick words of thanks to a number of people. I have a lot of great colleagues that have helped me think through these issues over the years, too many to name. But in particular, I should mention Sean Trier, because he and I worked on this book together, and that has been a long time in coming, but I'm really proud of the book that we have produced. I'm going to be talking a bit about it today. I'm also grateful to a lot of students in both my party's class and my constitutional convention classes over many years, because they've helped me think about these issues as well. And I'll give a shout out to my specific political parties class that is being forced to watch this because I was too lazy to come up with both a class period and a talk for today. Last, I just want to mention Elizabeth Sorensen. She was very helpful to me in thinking through the reform proposals that I'm going to allude to and discuss later. But let's jump into the talk. I have a very simple thesis, and it's this. Our Constitution and our current set of political parties do not fit together well. The Constitution demands a kind of political coalition that our parties do not currently provide. What do we need to do? Well, let me explain what the problem is. The Constitution, as I'm going to explain it in a second, forces you to think, what kind of party do I need to do to get control of the government? What kind of party do I need to create to get control of the government? And that party has to be both very sustained, has to last for more than just 2 or 3 or 4 years probably. And you have to have a sizable majority because there are so many institutions in American government that can affect policy and change things. And if you don't have a substantial majority for whatever program you are trying to put in place, then it will be overturned or modified or changed in short order if you don't put that together. So in essence, our Constitution creates the need for a party system that can't, at least under our current set of circumstances, meet the demands of that Constitution. And I think this is a problem. So let me back up quite a bit and talk a little bit about where the Constitution came from. And while the book that I've recently written with Sean Trier is not, I would say, a complete revision of where the Constitution came from, it does change things slightly from the literature that's common in political science and history and other disciplines. And the basic story that we tell is that there are 3 coalitions or 3 factions that form. There's a little bit of uncertainty here because there's actually, I would say, 2 coalitions over 3 dimensions with several different kinds of factions. The core reform states of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, they wanted to change everything about the government. They did not like the Articles of Confederation at all. They wanted to change the way we represented the people. They wanted to change the way we elect presidents, even to having an executive. They wanted to make the national government much more powerful. But the truth is there are only 3 states in this faction. So they couldn't really get anything done on their own. So they end up allying themselves with, at first, the Deep South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And that part of the coalition creates some changes that affect representation and the size and power and scope of the national government. The coalition of those slave states in the South, I'll come back to that in a second, and the core reform states, they create the House of Representatives. Instead of having representation be only by state, they also have it be people be represented as the people in a House of Representatives. They make the national government much more powerful than it was before the Constitutional Convention. Then they probably wouldn't have gone any further. But the problem was that the core reform states and other delegates of the Constitutional Convention wanted to create a chief executive. But it turns out that to do that, they had to ally themselves with some of the small states, and particularly small state delegates, that wanted to have an executive. Let me go forward just a bit here, and I'll show this slide. It may be kind of small. I don't know how well it's showing up on Zoom. Maybe I should have made them individual. But what you see before you on the left, in the middle, and on the right are 3 graphs that show the positions of the final version of the Constitution and the positions of the state delegations. The line that goes down the left side of each graph shows the status quo of the Articles of Confederation. If you look at each one of those graphs, what you will see on the left and in the middle is that the coalition that makes the government more proportional and makes the national government much more powerful on the dimension of federalism tend to be the Deep South, like North Carolina and South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. The Constitution, as you will note, is in the middle of each of those graphs to give a sense of where it fit relative to the states. But over on the right, what you get is something quite different. You get that Pennsylvania was allying with Virginia, another one of the core reform states, as well as Maryland and Massachusetts and Delaware. And that those states are the states that put together the independently elected executive. Now, why do I go into all of this story? Well, the reason that I do that is to make a couple of different points about where the Constitution came from that I think are crucial for understanding why it doesn't fit with our party system. First, there is no single majority that's monolithic and that helped create the US Constitution. only a few states, really Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, and only a few delegates inside of those states would have really agreed with everything that was going on in the Constitution. It isn't true in this sense that the American Constitution is a little bit like a Supreme Court decision, where you have a split decision and only one or two justices are in the controlling majority. That is the way to think about the Constitution, I think. And it sets up this notion that the Constitution was the work of many different hands, and in some ways even almost inconsistent institutions that get created. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it is worth pointing something out. What is the key interest of the Constitutional Convention? Well, if you look at those charts and think about it, it's slavery. And the reason it's slavery is that the slave owners are crucial for changing both the size and power and scope of the Constitution, but also making the national government more powerful. But they did not create the executive. And so these different institutions that get created come from whether or not slaves were in a key part of the coalition. Now, what I want to say at this point is that this complex structure that's created is the thing that really creates the need for the kind of political parties that we have. Let me say that the conventional wisdom about parties is that they're not in the Constitution, they weren't contemplated by the founders, they weren't anticipated, and in some sense, they're an extra constitutional innovation of American politics. And I have to say, I think that's not wrong, but I think it's incomplete. Because I think what really happened is that the Constitution, because of this complex process that created the Constitution, actually sets up the conditions for the kind of parties that we have now. And it creates the need, as I mentioned earlier, for political parties that are both sizable and sustained. Let me just show you a quick list here. Take a look at this list that's on your screen. If you would really like to control public policy in the United States, you need to either have control of, or at least close to control of, or possibly even a larger than usual majority in these institutions: the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presidency, the bureaucracy, the Supreme Court, because courts have grown much more important over through American history than they were at the time of the founding. And then there are 50 state governments that have their own set of policymaking contributions and abilities. This means that if you want to control policy, you had better have more than a simple majority in one of these institutions. You're going to have to create a coalition that is wide and broad and lets you get control of several of these institutions, maybe for certain kinds of policy changes, all of them. It's difficult to get into the specifics of this because it's probably different for different policy areas. But I think the point is that you need a very sizable, substantial coalition. Next, it had better be a sustained coalition, because these institutions get elected on different schedules at different points in time. And if you lose control of one of them, then lights out, you're done. You're not going to be able to control policy. But the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. So is the Senate in a sense, but it's in 3 groups because the senator serves for 6 terms. The bureaucracy is ongoing. The presidency is every 4 years. I don't want to be, and I don't have a theory of the deep state, but the bureaucracy is difficult to move in some respects. And this means you're going to have control for a longer period of time than just 2 or 3, or probably even 4 years. Going to need something more like a decade of control. Effectively, what the Constitution says is that you need a kind of supermajority. It doesn't define a particular level for that supermajority. It's not 60 seats with the filibuster. I'll mention in passing that the filibuster is an extra constitutional thing. It's not unconstitutional, but it's not required by the Constitution, and the Senate could get rid of it whenever it wants to, and perhaps should. But these are the rules that they have come up with, and we have to have a both sustained and sizable set of majorities. Well, this leads us to a question. The parties, are they giving us substantial and sustained coalitions? I'm just going to say in passing, because I want to keep the talk relatively short. I don't want to go through all of history. This has happened in the past. If you look at the 19th century, there were periods where the Republicans would be in control for at least a decade or 8 or sometimes 16 years. The same thing happened in the early part of the 20th century. And then it switched. The Democrats come in with the New Deal, and they had near total control of the government for a couple of decades. And there was kind of an echo of this in 1964 when the Democrats seized control again, reinvigorated their majority, and were able to, for a much
shorter period, make a bunch of major changes to American policy. There is a kind of echo period in my own lifetime with Reagan. I will point out that this was not a partisan coalition, and the Constitution doesn't say that you have to have a partisan coalition. I want to make this clear. You could have a coalition that was bipartisan. That's what Reagan did. It's called the Conservative Coalition. It was pretty much all of the Republicans. Southern Democrats voted with him on a number of issues. And so this is what created the Reagan reforms in the 1980s. But since the 1980s, we really haven't had this kind of situation anymore. Let me point to a couple of other books and a quick table. I'm not really saying anything new here, and that's why I want to point to these other authors. On the left, you see a book by Morris Fiorina, which my party students know well because I had them read that book. And then on the right, a book by Francis Lee, Insecure Majorities. Both of these books make similar points. And if you look at this table, you can see one of the points that they would make, which is that in the last 30 years, the presidency, the House, and the Senate have rarely, and never for longer than a couple of sessions, been in the hands of one party. It's true that Bill Clinton came in with the Democrats controlling the presidency, the House, and the Senate, but this was quickly ended when Republicans gained control for the first time in 40 years of the House and for the first time in several years of the Senate. Republicans eventually sort of come back into 2000 and gain some power, although the Senate was a tie. It was kind of complicated. It's worth noting that the Republican, I put an asterisk there. I guess I should have had one later on as well. George W. Bush did not win the so-called popular vote. Maybe I'll come back to that in a second. But pretty quickly after that, the Republicans did get a pretty well-functioning coalition, but they only had it for 2 electoral cycles, from 2004 from 2002 until 2006, when a Democratic wave happened. Similarly, the Democrats come into power, control everything in 2008. How long did they keep it? A good 2 years. Immediately, they lost it, and the Republicans were in charge of the House. The Republicans, I probably should have had an asterisk on 2016 because Trump also does not win the popular vote. They control the branches of government in 2016, but they do it for a single year. 2020 is still uncertain. It seems likely to me that the Republicans will control the Senate. But if you look at this historical record, it simply isn't the case that what we have is a party that has a sustained or even a large majority. I'll make this point as well. This is a graph I pulled from the New York Times a couple of days ago. It may be out of date by now. It's a cartogram showing the number of House seats captured by each party. They're not calling a number of seats yet, 6, I suppose, that will probably, I would say very likely go for the Republicans. The Democrats are likely to have a majority in the House of 222 seats or maybe 223. That's very small. And I've focused here on party control, but of course it's also true that you could have coalitions inside of the parties that are more moderate or more extreme and so on and so forth. So even though Democrats expected to gain 10 or 15 seats in this most recent election, this election that we have just gone through this last month has proven the fact that the parties don't have large, sustainable coalitions at this point. And that, I guess, is the problem. Now, I want to talk about a few other trends that are true about recent years that I think are important for understanding this set of results. I want to start, and here again, I'm going to recommend a book by a colleague named Hans Knoll at Georgetown University. One thing that has changed and may make it harder for us to obtain these kinds of really large coalitions is that, we're updating, I guess. Is that showing on Zoom or not? Okay. Maybe we'll get back to that in a second. We have much more ideological coalitions than we once used to have. There's a figure there in the bottom right-hand corner of the keynote presentation when we get it back that shows his work on how ideology has just become a much more important feature of American political life. In the late 19th and the early 20th century, it was not, you didn't really see ideology being as powerful as it was. It didn't predict the actual positions of intellectuals, the kinds of people who create ideology, as Hans Knoll theorizes. But in recent years, and I suspect if we extended that graph past the 1990s, you would see it's even higher now. Ideology has become extremely important. And our period of close, non-decisive elections does coincide with these more ideological coalitions. I can't really prove that there's a causal relationship here, but it is striking that now that we have more ideological coalitions, that it is harder to form the kinds of majorities that the Constitution wants. Let me make one other point about something else that has changed. And superficially, it probably seems like it's a change that should make non-ideological coalitions more powerful. There are many more independents than there used to be, especially if you compare things back to the late 1960s and 1970s. And to understand this, I think there's actually a couple of different books that you should think about reading. The first one goes back to the 1980s. It's a book by BYU's own David Magleby and some other authors. And the claim that he makes in this book is that these independents tend to mostly be independent leaners. They're people who lean towards one party or the other. And this group of people are independent largely in name only. They vote for Democrats or Republicans fairly consistently. And this is very true, especially when it comes to how they vote. I think in some ways you can make the case that they're distinct from the other partisans that they lean towards. But let's just make no mistake about this at all. In terms of how they vote, they're really not all that different than the other partisans. In fact, in many ways, they're more partisan than the weak partisans in each party can be. But that's not the whole story about independence. The other piece of the story that you need to understand is that independents, despite being very partisan in the way that they relate to the world, also are kind of dissatisfied. So the second book that I'll recommend here is one by Samara Klar and Yana Krupnikov. It's called Independent Politics. And the point that they make is that partisans are pretty disaffected. They're unhappy with the American political system. They don't like things. And it's even true to some degree, I would say, of the weak partisans. They also are increasingly dissatisfied with the politics that we get. So in essence, we have a more ideological set of coalitions, but we also have a group of people that, though they're very partisan in their behavior, actually are not all that thrilled with the kind of governing and politics that we have. I'll mention one other thing. Excuse me. And it comes from the article that Stan was kind enough to mention in his introduction. It's by work that I did with Mike Barber. And essentially what we did was ask people, hey, how much do you follow your party leaders? We didn't just ask them that because there's a good chance they would have told us, well, I think for myself, I would not just follow along with some sort of party leader. I'm my own man or woman or whatever. But in an experimental setting where we showed them some of Trump's positions that were either liberal or conservative, we found that Republicans were moved either in a liberal or a conservative direction, depending on what cue they got from Trump. I won't belabor the whole point of that article, but I'll just point out it is the case that party leaders are able to move people in their party, leaners, weak partisans, and so on and so forth, in the direction of the policy that they want. And so again, we have this moment where people are dissatisfied, but are still quite partisan. Let's sum up and go back to the Constitution for a second, okay? As I've said, the Constitution demands these kinds of sizable coalitions, but now that we have more ideological coalitions in the parties, we end up with relatively narrow coalitions. We don't get the really broad kind of ones that we might hope for. And the Constitution wants sustained coalitions that are in control of government for more than 2 or 3 or 4 years to actually affect policy. But as I hope I've shown you, it's not the case that at least in the last 30 years that our elections provide that. Instead, what we're getting are coalitions, especially in Congress, that are much more ideological, and in the public that are more partisan, not necessarily as ideological, but quite party loyal. And this leaves the public in a situation where they're very dissatisfied with government. They're not happy with it. They're cynical. Levels of trust are falling. Really, lots of measures that social scientists use about the nature of government show that people are dissatisfied. So I want to say here that I would say when we look at this whole picture, it's not really quite the case that the Constitution was premised on the absence of political parties. It's more that the set of institutions created by the Constitution created the conditions to have parties that were required to have supermajorities of a certain kind. And the parties don't really want to provide that. At least for now, we're not getting that. This has been true for a while. Think back to when Trump came into office. He promised a number of policies. Did he deliver on them? Mostly not. There are a few that he delivered on. Probably the most significant policy innovation of the Trump administration would be a tax cut of various sorts that really wasn't so much Trump's individual sort of policy taste. Joe Biden is promising a number of policies now, but to be honest, I don't expect, given the situation that we have in Congress, that he's going to be able to deliver on them. And this will leave voters that supported either of those candidates dissatisfied and unhappy and feeling like, hey, we voted for change and we didn't get any of that sort of thing. And we're just going to continue down this path. And I think the same thing have been true of the other presidents in earlier eras. I could tell a story about President Obama and what's colloquially known as Obamacare and how that was changed over time. And it doesn't really reflect the vision of that he was putting in place. But I want to go ahead for the last portion of the talk to talk about this. Well, what have we done? What do we do? What happens now? Now, you may be satisfied. You may think, hey, I think things are okay. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. I'm probably not going to be able to convince you. But what I'd like to start off with is, given a constitutional system that we have, there's a kind of necessary logic of reform. If you are going to change things, and again, you might not want to, but if you're going to change things, there are essentially two possible directions or a bit of both that you could engage in. The first one is that we could change the constitutional requirements. We could make it easier to change policy. In essence, this would mean centralizing power in some way, making it less possible to frustrate a majority that is less sustained, making it easier to get control of policymaking in the national government, perhaps at the expense of the states. The other possibility is that we can change the nature of our partisan coalitions. We can incentivize them in some way to form broader coalitions that take in a larger group of people with electoral mandates. One of those two things would have to be the direction of reform, or of course, we could just wait and see what happens over the next 20 years and see if we're satisfied with that. I don't think people will be satisfied, but I suppose it's possible. Now, let's take the first one, changing the constitutional requirements. Given what I've told you about the Constitution, what is the branch of government that is most likely to be able to centralize power? Well, clearly it's not Congress, okay? Congress simply can't do it because Congress is divided into two chambers. Power is heavily divided inside of the House of Representatives and the Senate. I don't think it's the courts either, because the courts also have lots of limitations. They can't take up every policy. This leaves us with the presidency, and it's an interesting institution. It was created by that unique combination of the core reform states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, as well as some small state delegates that defect from the small state position and say, let's have a much stronger president. So we could do something with that, with the presidency. A suggestion that has been put forth by William Howell and Terry Moe is that we take a step in the direction of a much stronger presidency by giving the president much stronger agenda-setting powers. The specifics of their proposal I'll leave to the book, which I do recommend, but it boils down to giving the president the ability to make proposals and force Congress to vote on those proposals and not let Congress duck them or amend them and so on and so forth. You don't have to agree with every point here, but it's an argument worth thinking about and worth contemplating, because I think if we are going to move in a somewhat more parliamentary direction, this is the most likely possibility. The presidency is just better set up to centralize power than any of the other branches are. Let's turn to the other possibility. What if we change the nature of our partisan coalitions? Well, one book that's worth reading here is a book by Lee Drutman. He pushes for some form of proportional representation or ranked choice voting, and what he is hoping is that we'll break the two-party system. I have to admit that even though I really admire this book, I don't know that I'm entirely convinced that we could break the two-party system. Because I don't think after writing this book on the Constitution that I any longer believe that parties are in place largely because of single-member districts. I think we have the two-party system we do partially because of that, but also partially because our parties have to coordinate across such a wide array of institutions. And this forces the parties to, be at least a majority party, but it also constrains them a bit from going much further into becoming a supermajority in some respects. So I'm less confident that we'll actually be able to get to multi-party democracy, but I do like the idea of shifting to more proportional representation and ranked choice voting to force the parties to think about having broader coalitions and who are the membership of those coalitions might be. Another possibility is to reform primaries, to have runoffs that force parties to move to the center. There is a very limited amount of evidence starting to come in from some states that have innovated in this way. There's a top 2 primary system in California. Maine is experimenting with ranked choice voting. I would say the early returns are not definitive, though they are encouraging that this does make the parties think more about a slightly broader coalition, a less extreme coalition in some sense, though I would say the jury is still out. Now I want to give my pet favorite okay? This is the one that I think is pretty important, and it has to do with the size of the House of Representatives. It's this graph right here, which I just pulled off the New York Times, and it has to do with this pattern that we see that sort of using a cube function, you should see a larger number of seats in the representative chambers of legislatures in larger countries. Now you can see on that graph, the United Kingdom and Turkey and Mexico tend to follow this. The United Kingdom has in particular a large number of what they call writings and members of parliament. So they have more than usual. The United States in this graph is quite a ways off the line. In fact, I would go further and say this graph is actually a little bit inaccurate because it has the United States as having 535 representatives. It's not really accurate. It's only the House that represents the people. The Senate ends up representing states, has biases in that sense because of our federalist system. So the US is even further off the line than you imagine. Personally, I would favor increasing the size of the House substantially, making it, maybe not twice as large, but perhaps adding 300 or 400 seats. That's close to twice as large, I suppose. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, how is that going to help? Well, what I do think it would do, and it would have a number of other benefits, but for purposes of our talk today, the main thing that it would do is it would force each party to deal with a broader set of views that are more granular on a particular level inside of their party. It would incentivize the parties to come up with solutions and ideas that satisfied a broader range of people. Can I prove that that would happen? No, I can't. But I think it is something worth considering. And in general, I think we should be considering these reforms. Now, there are a couple of different objections I want to kind of preempt. Maybe you will give me some in Q&A, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But let me talk about a couple of different objections, one from the progressive side and one from a conservative side. Progressives might say, hey, look, loser, professor, we do too win majorities. It's just that the system won't give our majorities enough power and maybe it's biased against us. Well, there is truth to this. In particular, I just want to point out the Senate is, at least in our current political system, is biased against Democrats because the Senate advantages rural states. I understand why Democrats don't like that. It doesn't work for them. But I do have a rejoinder to the progressives, and it basically goes like this. The left wins small, inconsistent majorities. And look, it's debatable about whether or not those majorities should have more power, but they're not winning sizable and sustained majorities given our current system. And if they want to amend the Constitution, they're going to have to come up with a coalition that is in favor of that is larger than the one that they have now. They're not going to be able to change the American system winning 51% of the vote. They're going to have to get to something much more sizable and much more sustained. Let's turn to the conservative objection. They might basically say, hey, reform is a bad idea because this is how the Constitution should work and we should not tinker with it. Now, in some sense, if you're satisfied with government the way it is now, if you're satisfied with declining levels of trust, people being disengaged, dissatisfied, et cetera, fine. I won't argue with you. I will say that I think you're wrong. But if you're satisfied with that, I'm not sure that there's much I could say. However, whenever I talk to a conservative on this point about how the Constitution should not be tinkered with, I am just compelled to remind them something about the founding generation. Could we just run through a quick timeline here? In the 1760s, there was a social movement for change in the United States. They were unhappy about the way their mother country was governing them, regulations being put on them, et cetera. Local institutions spring up that competed with their actual political institutions. On top of this, by the mid-1770s, they're declaring independence as a country, and they're declared independence as individual states as well. People often forget that. In the mid to late 1770s, they write new constitutions for almost all of the states. True, they borrowed from what they had, but they did change a great deal. In 1781, they write the Articles of Confederation, a complete and total form of government to govern the federation that they had created. But in 1787, 6 years after it comes into authorization, they completely scrap it and change to the US Constitution, the one that we know now. Well, sort of the one that we know now, because within 5 years, they had managed to add 10 amendments to that Constitution. And within about a decade of that point, they had actually changed the election of the president process. Can I say this? If you look at this record and believe that those people in that time period didn't like to tinker with institutions, then you are just wrong. They like to tinker with institutions a lot. So I do not think that we should stop being willing to tinker with the institutions that we have. Indeed, I would say we amend the Constitution too little. And in large measure, what has happened is that we've solidified into two ideological coalitions that are not very good at compromising or winning hearts and minds to their position. And I'll conclude with this slide. You don't normally see political scientists quoting George Washington. There's a case for this because he wasn't an intellectual in the sense that, appeals to political scientists or those sorts of people. But he was someone, perhaps the person in American history, who had the most political, practical experience. He was like the chief executive for the country for a number of years when he was General Washington. He helped write the Constitution, then he is the president for 8 years to get things going. When he wrote his farewell address, he said something in it. I'm only going to quote part of it, but I hope it conveys the message that he thinks that a certain spirit of party, perhaps the kind of spirit of party that we have now, is dangerous. I'll just quote him here. "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." I don't think we're there yet, but as I look at the record of presidents over the last few years, they have consistently tried to get more and more power. I haven't made this a particularly partisan talk, but if you don't look at the recent presidencies, first of Barack Obama, and then far more so, I would say, of Donald Trump, and think that presidents are trying to accumulate more and more power to help their partisan side, then I think you're not paying attention to what is going on. And part of the reason I'm for reform is that ultimately, I think this warning from Washington should be taken seriously. This is something that could happen. We can't rule out this possibility. The Constitution is good. I think it preserves liberties in many ways, but it's not perfect, and we should think about reforming it. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Pope. That was a very interesting, engaging presentation, lots of information, lots of ideas to think about here. And so we'll now invite some questions. We have one that's already been posed by Tanner Taguchi, I think is how you'd say his name. And Tanner, I'm going to ask you to ask your question. We're going to see if the technology here will work. And if it does, why don't you please unmute yourself and turn your camera on. Tell us what you're studying, and then ask your question to Professor Pope, and we'll see if that works.
Wonderful. I'm actually a student in Professor Pope's political parties class currently, and I'm an American Studies major. I just had a question about the situation in Nebraska, in Nebraska, they conduct nonpartisan elections. And based on some of the research that I saw in earlier political science classes, it seems that while campaigning, candidates tend to stick to traditional two-party platform kind of rhetoric while they're campaigning. The votes in the legislature and the work that they do on behalf of public policy seems to be kind of nonpartisan. They're able to be more individualized in the way that they approach their work. Is there anything to be learned in Nebraska that could be applied on a national scale feasibly, you think?
There's probably something to be learned, Tanner, at least, by the way, hi, Tanner, at least the way you put that. But I have to admit, I don't think that Nebraska is going to translate to national politics, because it's easier at the state level to have a different set of policy priorities that can sometimes unify Democrats and Republicans. I didn't call out his research, but Dan Hopkins, a political scientist, has a book, and I'm failing to remember the title of it now, but it's about how our politics have become more nationalized in recent years. And I think that's true, and I also think it's bad. And I think it means that even though we could probably learn things from the Nebraska example, I just sort of despair of this working on a national level for the reasons that I gave about how the Constitution works. I think it's just the case that the Constitution sets up a situation where parties have to coordinate across so many institutions that they will never truly go away. The stakes are just too high in the national government. And so I don't think we're going to be able to change this by moving in a more nonpartisan direction, as I think you were sort of indicating there.
Thank you very much. Madeline, I guess I don't know your last name here, but again, if you can unmute yourself, tell us what you're studying and who you are, and then ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Madeline Mayer. I'm studying Earth and Space Science Education, and I loved one of your PowerPoint slides, and so I took a picture of it. Is that okay, or if not?
Oh, that's
I
fine.
can... Okay.
I don't care.
This talk was super interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay. That seems to be then a kind of a practical question. While students are thinking about some things, let me ask you a little bit about the primary system. I don't know if you tuned in a week or two ago, the Wheatley Institute hosted a discussion with Jeff Flake, the former senator of Arizona.
Yeah.
And he talked about how in his state, things have become so polarized because of President Trump that you couldn't win a primary if you don't support him in the Republican Party, but then you can't win a statewide election if you do support him. So what, just expand, can you talk a little bit about what you think the role of primaries is, and has that contributed to this ideological, increase of ideology in the parties?
I think it's contributed some. I think it may have contributed less than we imagine, but I definitely think it has contributed some. And I certainly wouldn't disagree with Senator Flake. I think I'm sure he's right that it's not easy or perhaps even possible to win the Republican primary and then go on to win the election, at least at this point in time. That's not just true in Arizona, by the way. It would be true in any number of other states. We just don't have that many states that are test cases for that. So I do think primaries play a role. Now, why did I say that it probably plays less of a role than we imagine? When we study the primary electorate, they don't look wildly different than the general election. It's just that there are fewer people involved in the primary election. So I have a feeling that you have to think not only about primaries, but also donor networks, issue organizations, people that give to campaigns, just the nature of the parties as they try to form a coalition that is really just barely good enough to satisfy their strongest activists, but really gets them essentially to 51 or 52%. Doesn't get them much further than that. And I think that is probably a greater limitation on our system right now than primaries, though I take the point and I agree that they play a role in constraining elected officials.
Okay, thank you. Joseph McMurray now has actually a couple of questions. So Joseph, again, if you can unmute yourself, tell us what you're studying, and then go ahead and ask Professor Pope your question, please.
Sure. So I'm actually on faculty in the economics department, and it's good to see you. I very much enjoyed the presentation. My first question was, I actually like your idea of expanding Congress, and I agree with your intuition that would be helpful, but I'm just wondering, is that politically feasible? I mean, is there anyone, any influential individual or group that's sort of proponing this, or?
No, there is not.
Okay.
I would say, though, in response, none of the things that I proposed or even discussed,
Yeah, sure,
being plausible, are not really being proposed by the parties right now. And there's a very good reason for this that I'm sure Joey knows, which is they got to power with the system that we have. And so they are going to be reluctant to change that system dramatically. But I gave the talk based on kind of an academic perspective about what we need, not what I think is most likely.
sure. No, I appreciate that very much. But yeah, sometimes there are forces that I don't know about that are moving in these directions, and I was curious if you knew of any.
I will say this, I know of people on both sides of the aisle who will talk about it, but I know of no organized push to increase the House. And there are many who would give counter arguments to push to increasing the size of the House. So I don't think it's terribly plausible at the moment.
Right. Yeah, that's fine. My other question was, you talked about why, or how we need, you need to have a party, sort of the two parties need to be strong enough, or one party needs to be strong enough to actually have a majority kind of across institutions, kind of stable over time. And you kind of mentioned this in passing, but But why would it need to be a party that provides that role? Why not some nonpartisan coalition?
Well,
which,
yeah,
which, you know,
it definitely could be. And I tried to give one brief example of this in the talk, but I'm really glad you asked this question because I don't think the coalitions have to be partisan, but I think at the moment that's the thing worth talking about. The example I briefly alluded to in the talk was the Reagan coalition of the 1980s. That was a cross-party coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats. And though they weren't in power quite as long as other coalitions were, and in some ways you could actually extend this back to Ford and Nixon if you wanted to look more over time. That coalition was nonpartisan. It was based on more ideological affinity, and it set a lot of policies. And I think that's possible, but the problem is that we now have ideological parties. And so it's very difficult for them to reach across the aisle. I have great sympathy for the notion that it would be great if we had less ideological parties so that we could have the kind of coalitions that would meet the standard of the Constitution. But I don't see that in the offing because our parties, as Noel's work shows, have become so much more ideological and fairly rigid and even narrow in some respects.
well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Maddie Mayer now has a question. So again, Maddie, please turn on your camera and unmute yourself. Tell us what you're studying and ask your question.
Hi, I'm a journalism major and I'm not a political science major. So I was just wondering if you could clarify, you said that the Constitution demands sizable and sustainable majorities. For what purpose? In order to change policy or?
Yeah, to change policy, to control policy. If the only thing you want to do is, make the trains run on time and pass Milk Day and We Love Trees Day that you're going to get everyone to vote for, then you don't really need a sizable or a sustained coalition. If you would like to institute a new healthcare system, if you would like to fight a war or stop a war or change our policy, even on relatively less controversial matters like sometimes certain forms of trade or how we're going to deal with 5G networks in the future, then yeah, you're going to need some kind of coalition of some sort that is going to be able to put those things together. And these days they tend to be partisan coalitions.
And where in the Constitution can I find that idea of a sizable and sustainable majority?
You cannot. It's not in the text of the Constitution. What I was trying to argue at the beginning of the talk is that it's implied by the Constitution. Sure, it doesn't say you have to have a sizable majority, but what it does is create so many different institutions that you have to get control of that if you don't have a sizable majority, you're out of luck. You're not really going to be able to set policy or control it in the United States. Same thing with the sustained. By having these staggered election periods and having a situation where you're required to essentially hold on to government for quite some time, in part because you want to influence the bureaucracy, which takes a long time to change and turn, then you're going to have a sustained coalition. So I grant that the Constitution never says that you have to have those, but you still need to do it. And if you don't, you're not going to be able to set policy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Justin Martinez now, again, please do the same. Tell us what you're studying and ask Professor Pope your question.
Okay, forgive me, I'm actually not a student at the Y. I study at the U, but I am a social studies teacher in the Salt Lake Valley. My question is, what do you see as the trajectory of the Republican Party since the Trump presidency? I attended an American Historical Association panel a couple weeks ago where scholars discussed and claimed that Trump's presidency was a continuation of Barry Goldwater's GOP influence. Do you see Trump's place and position as the continuing of prior Republican leaders, or as an ideological juncture that further shifts GOP measures and politicians?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to disagree with this Goldwater extension thing. He does not look like an extension of Barry Goldwater to me at all. I do think Trump picked up on threads in the Republican Party that have always existed. So I think you can overstate how much of a disjunction Donald Trump actually was. There has always been a kind of populist, anti-immigrant, I don't think it's a huge component of the Republican Party, but frankly, racist component of the Republican Party. And Trump appealed to those notions and has made them more powerful in the Republican Party. So I guess what I would say is he is a point of discontinuity in certain issues and a point of emphasis. He's not a complete break with Republicans from the past. he is a continuation of many of their threads, but he has placed new emphasis in different places. And I wish I knew the answer to your underlying question, which is, where are we going to go in 2024? Trump seems to think that he's going to run again and succeed. I am skeptical of that, but I will admit I haven't really thought it all the way through. I suppose it's possible that he's going to be able to do that, but I am skeptical that this will work in the future. Then again, I was skeptical that he would win the nomination last time, so that tells you how smart I am. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think he's a point of disjunction, but in some ways he may be more of a symptom than an actual cause. One thing that was going on before Trump is that the Republicans are becoming more the party of the white working class, and that is just a trend that has been happening over a long time. I don't think Trump caused that. I think he's a reflection of that. And Democrats are gathering a more professionalized, frankly, wealthier set of constituents, and I expect those things to continue.
And a follow-up question, continuing with what you just said with your last clause. The United States is increasingly multicultural. We see, especially within the state of Utah, that this is going to explode within the upcoming decades. The Hinckley Institute has already demonstrated that with the Latino population. And we know that within the next 30 or so years, that Spanish speakers are going to be among the largest population of Spanish speakers worldwide. So how do you see the constantly increasing multicultural dynamics within American society, especially among Latinos, as a game changer with American politics, national and local?
So I think it's definitely changing the way American society functions and works. But in general, I would say that our worry should be overstating it. I'll give two reasons for thinking that. The first is, I've been hearing that Latinos or Hispanics or whatever classification we want to use is going to change American politics for a good 20 to 30 years now. It hasn't happened. I'm open to it happening. I even probably think it would be good, but I don't know that I'm convinced that it's going to happen on the timeline that we have in mind. And the reason for that is that lots of ethnic groups become more Americanized over time. An example that I could give from the past, like if I were to point to the Irish or the Italians, there was lots of rhetoric when the biggest waves of immigration came about how they were going to dramatically change American society. And to a degree, just like Hispanics are changing American society, they do change it, but they change it less than we imagine that they do, because third and fourth generation immigrants are less distinct than their parents were. And they kind of, in some sense, get absorbed into American politics. So that's why I'm a little skeptical that it will dramatically change things. On the point about what could it change in small ways, I just expect we're going to hear a lot more Spanish being spoken in Utah. I expect that you're going to see definitely more respect for and, shall we say, homage paid to institutions and ideas that are important to that community. I don't think it's going to fundamentally reorder American society, but I think it's going to, like all the other waves of immigration in the past, subtly change it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. For those, I just wanted to ask one more question here. Since no one else has posed one on the chat, I'll go ahead. Is there any possibility, do you think, Professor Pope, of the emergence of a third party, either within individual regions or nationally? Or is this a problem with sort of the winner take all election system that we have?
So short answer, no. Long answer, if I got my wish that we dramatically expanded the House, I think it's quite possible that you might see something that was party-esque form on a regional basis. So let me expand on that. I don't think we're going to see anything change. I think the standard answer people give is that we have a winner-take-all system. I gave that answer as a political scientist for many years, but that's why we have a two-party system. I now think that's only part of the answer. And the other part of the answer is that for the parties to actually affect policy, to do the thing that they want to do, they have to get control of so many institutions that you just have to form a majoritarian kind of coalition. And in fact, what they really have to do is form a kind of supermajority coalition to change policy. So I just don't see that changing. Now, if we did expand the House, I think it's possible that you would see Utah Republicans perhaps being distinct from national Republicans, or perhaps Alabama Democrats being distinct from national Democrats. I'm not sure that would truly be like new parties, but what it might be are different coalitions inside of the House of Representatives in particular, and inside of the parties that were pushing and pulling and tugging on policy to try to set things in the direction that they wanted. But as Joey pointed out, I don't know that I should have a lot of hope for us expanding the House of Representatives. I'm not incredibly hopeful that's going to happen.
All right, well, thank you very much, Professor Pope. What an engaging presentation. Lots of things to think about and consider. A great contribution to our discussion. So again, I'll ask all of those who are participating, give us a nice Zoom thank you to Professor Pope. Thanks again.
Thank you.